Good day and welcome to today's Huntington Learning Center webinar, A New Academic Year, A New Admissions Landscape. This is a great webinar for everyone who's getting ready to apply for college. I'm Michael Hackmer. I'll be your moderator for today's event. And on behalf of Huntington Learning Center, I want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. We know there's a lot going on, your busy schedules, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Now I'd like to talk a little bit about Huntington Learning Center. For those of you who don't know, Huntington's actually been around for 45 years. And we're a leading tutoring and test prep center with centers all across the country. There are three things that I think really differentiate Huntington from other tutoring and test prep centers or just going out and hiring a tutor for your son or daughter. And those three things are this. First, everybody that we bring in that works with your child is highly trained and certified. So we make sure that all of our tutors receive the necessary training and certification in order to best present the material and work with your child. The other key differentiator is that we're accredited by Middle States Association. And the reason why that's significant is because as your child continues their educational journey and they get into higher education, they look for degrees or certifications. Typically, any higher education institution that provides a degree or certification is actually accredited by Middle States. So that's important to us. And lastly, but certainly not least, in fact, I think this is probably the most important differentiator, is that everything we do is highly individualized. We get kids in, we do an assessment, because while every child may struggle with certain similar things, right, deficiencies in math, trouble with English, spelling, test taking, at the end of the day, every child learns a little bit differently, has different strengths and weaknesses, has different gaps in knowledge, and it's really important for us to identify what those gaps are, what those strengths and weaknesses are, how your child learns best, so that we can develop a personalized program for your child so that they're ultimately more successful. And the results really do speak for themselves when you look at math and reading in terms of grade levels. On average, in about 3 months, we can get that up by about 2 grade levels, both in math and in English. And some kids have even better experience than that. We're going to be talking about college admissions. And of course, with college admissions, there's the SAT, there's the ACT. And when it comes to test scores, with the SAT, on average, you're looking at an increase in 229 points on the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT, which is really, really significant. The other great thing about Huntington is with all of our programs, we do offer in-person and in some cases we offer online options as well. So there's a great deal of flexibility for your student to make sure that they get the tutoring and test prep that they need.
So now I have the great distinction of introducing Jeff Selingo. So Jeff is not just a journalist and an author, but he is really an expert on higher education and college admissions. He's written 2 New York Times bestsellers, Who Gets In and Why. He spent a year inside the college admissions process. And this was named one of the most 100 notable books in 2020 by New York Times. He's also a contributor to The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and we really highly value the partnership that we have with Jeff here at Huntington. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Jeff, who has a lot of great content to share with you today. Jeff?
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thrilled to have all of you with me tonight. So I just want to talk a little bit about how this night is going to play out. So, whether this is your first webinar with me and the Huntington Learning Center, or you've been with us before, my hope is that you're going to learn a lot more about the admissions process. There's a lot to know, and we're not going to be able to cover everything tonight. If you've been with us before, some of this might be familiar to you. We're also hosting 2 more sessions of this webinar series in January and March that will continue to cover additional topics critical to know at that time of year. As Michael mentioned, we are taking questions and we'll try to get to as many as we can tonight. If I don't get to them, I'll try to answer as many of them in the future in my bi-weekly newsletter, which you can sign up for at my website at jeffselingo.com. So here's how the night will play out in 3 parts. The first is going to be this first 10, 15 minutes or so. I'm going to explain the higher ed system in the US and the admissions process that governs it. I'll take a deeper dive on the application itself and what really matters in getting in. Then in the second part, I'm going to welcome David Kiskowski from Clemson University for a conversation about admissions, so you can hear directly from an admissions professional who's on the ground at a major state university. And then about 20 minutes before the hour, I'll talk about an issue that is often on the minds of families at the very end of the process, and that's finding the right fit, but really should be a focus much earlier in the process, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And then, of course, we'll take some questions and have some answers given time. So with that, let's get started. So first, I want to put you all in the right mindset for tonight. College is what economists often refer to as an experiential good. You don't know what you're buying until after you buy it. It's also a really emotional purchase. For those of you who went to college, you might have an emotional tie to your alma mater as a place where your life was changed, or maybe you met your life partner. Or for our own kids, we see it as a rite of passage. Thus, oftentimes I see kind of logic go out the window because we're trying to repeat our own college experience or give our kids all the tools to reach their potential. But at the end of the day, college is a business. And the admissions process is about getting customers. So you need to be a smart consumer as a parent and as a family. Remember, you're essentially buying a car in many cases, and not only one car, but maybe one each year of 4 years of college, or you're buying essentially what is a house in many parts of the country. And just like you wouldn't shortchange those purchases by not test driving the car or getting an inspection on the house, I don't think you should shortchange this process either. As I regularly remind parents and students, although they might be the consumer here, they might be driving the process, admissions is in many ways not about them. It's about the college's priorities. And in any given year, colleges might want more full payers or more kids from the Dakotas. So just because a college, for example, has a 50% acceptance rate or a 25% acceptance rate, it doesn't mean you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting in or a 1 in 2 chance of getting in. Now, this is not to say this is not a terrific process, and it's not a, it's going to be a life-changing experience for your kids. And it's important, it's an important rite of passage, and they're going to gain lifelong friends. But at the same time, this is a purchase, and I think it's really important that we approach it like that. Now, if you're on the webcast tonight and you went to college, it's likely you went to college in the late 1980s or early 1990s. And if this is your first time through the process, that means it's been perhaps 30 years since you interacted with higher education in a meaningful way. And so we often talk about higher education as a system, but in many ways that makes it seem more organized than it really is. It's really a collection of systems, a loose federation of colleges and universities, an ecosystem. And I want to briefly describe that ecosystem tonight. You know, we talk a lot about college in the United States, but we struggle to agree on exactly what we even mean by that word. For example, what's the difference between a liberal arts college and a research university? What are the requirements for a 4-year degree? What does it mean to major in something? Now, for your purposes, it's critical that you answer some of these questions and get a sense of what you're looking for before you apply. Otherwise, in many ways, it's like walking into a car dealership and saying, you know, I heard you should get some type of automobile, maybe a pickup truck or a minivan. Is there even much of a difference? I just need to know it has 4 wheels, right? You would never do that by just walking into a dealership and just picking any car out. You're going to do a lot of research on it, and you're going to know the differences between the cars. And that's what you have to figure out when you look at a map like this. This map here provides an illustration of the geography of higher education. All these dots represent all the nonprofit colleges and universities across the country. Now, we could do an entire webinar breaking this down into something more manageable for applicants, because at the end of the day, remember, out of these 3,900 degree granting institutions in the United States, you might only apply to 8 or 10 or 12 of these institutions. Now, we don't have the time tonight to go and break down each of these different types of institutions, but I want us to think about the college landscape, this college ecosystem, through the prism of the type of institution and the cost. So the first lens is to view colleges through the type of institution. Are they a public institution? Are they a private institution? Are they a 2-year institution or are they a 4-year institution? It makes that 3,900 number a lot more manageable. Now, 2-year colleges, which represent about 21% of enrollment in the United States, many high school students go to community colleges because they want to transfer. Indeed, 80% of them go to community colleges thinking they're going to want to transfer, but only about 20% end up doing, only about 11% earn a 4-year degree. So if you are thinking about going to a community college because you want to transfer to a 4-year college, make sure the community college you can do that has a good relationship with a 4-year institution and make sure your credits are going to transfer. Now, most students go to public universities. 48% go to 4-year public universities. And when you include the community colleges in that number, we're talking about 70% essentially go to some sort of public institution. Now, this is an important thing to consider because when you look at the top 30 national universities in the US News and World Report rankings, for example, or you look at the top 10 or 15 universities in last week's Wall Street Journal rankings, they're all private universities. And a lot of the discussion in the news media is about private universities. So you would probably think, wow, a lot of people go to private colleges and universities, but as you can see from this, only about 31% do. Now, the second lens to view colleges through is cost. Now, this is critical, as I'll talk about later, because financial fit is an element of fit when we talk about the fit of college. And it's nearly impossible to know how much you're going to pay before you apply and get accepted, but you should still at least think about what the price of college is going to be as you're applying. Now, there are two important pieces to consider here. One is public universities. Average cost according to the College Board. Now, remember, if you're going to an out-of-state public university, you're not a resident, you're going to probably pay almost twice as much at many places. Now, a lot of students I know look to out-of-state public universities. In fact, today, about a third of flagship public universities have more out-of-state freshmen than they do in-state freshmen. You're essentially paying twice the rate of the in-state rate. And so that's something to consider as you're looking at public universities, that not all public universities are equal on that front. The second piece is that the sticker price of the privates, obviously a much bigger number there, as you'll see. And I'll talk later about a framework that I have called buyers and sellers. But it's important to remember that at many private colleges, especially those not at the very top of the ranking, no one really pays full price. So the price of a private college might end up being the same price as a public college, depending on how much aid that they give. Indeed, the average discount rate, as you can see in this next slide, at private colleges is about 50%. And this chart shows just among small liberal arts colleges that beyond the 50%, basically no one pays the full price anymore. So that means even if you don't have financial need, you're going to get a discount in the form of what they call a merit scholarship. Again, the average discount of a private college today is about 50%. So as you're trying to narrow down that list of 3,900 colleges and universities, that map I showed you earlier, or maybe it's the 1,400 colleges that have more than 500 students and are 4-year colleges, it's important to think about size, the type of institution, and the cost among other factors. Those things can start to make that big number feel a lot smaller. So my advice is don't get caught up in the names of schools when you make your initial list. Think about a campus. Do you want a rural campus, an urban campus, a suburban campus? Do you want big, as in 10,000 plus students, or do you want something kind of medium size, maybe a 5,000 student body? Or do you want something really small, like a liberal arts college at 2,500 students? Do you want something far from home or close to home? Do you want big time sports? Do you want a big research university? These are the campuses you should be thinking about. And many of these campuses exist within a day's drive of your house. So you could go visit a big state university. You could go visit an urban private university. You could go visit a small liberal arts college. Don't think about the names of these schools, right? What you really are visiting are types of campuses. And then once you decide what type of campus you want a big school, a small school, a rural school, an urban school, then you could start putting the names of those schools to those preferences. And that's the key difference here between a campus and a school, because I think so many people start their list and they just start putting names of schools on that list without being able to say what they really want out of that. Now, once you have that list, then you're going to be ready to start applying to college. And this is the application process. Now, just like there isn't one type of college, there really isn't one process to apply to college. Now, we're going to be talking in a few minutes about different timelines and deadlines, but when your application arrives at a college or university, as you'll see, there's no one way to review applications. Just like there isn't one application process, there's no one way to review applications. Now many colleges with competitive admissions have what they call a holistic review. Institutions that take almost every applicant, they might have cutoffs for GPA and test scores, and then take everyone above those test scores. There's a movement now in higher education that they call direct admission, where you actually might get a notice that you're into a school before you even apply, solely based on your grades and test scores alone. But as I said, most schools still practice something they call holistic admissions, where they're looking at a variety of these factors: high school courses, grades, test scores, activities, essays, and recommendations. These are the big 6 things that they're looking at. And the top 3 at many places are often the most important. They're looking at the courses you took in high school. What was available to you in high school? So almost every application comes along with something called a high school profile. And so the admissions officers know what courses were available to you in high school, and then which ones you took of those courses, and then from your transcript, what grade you got. Obviously, you can't take every single difficult course that's offered by your high school, but they're looking for students who challenge themselves in high school and got often, pretty good grades in those courses. And then if you have submitted test scores, and we're going to be talking about test scores in a minute, if you've submitted test scores, they're going to be looking at those test scores in relation to your high school courses and grades. Those 3 things at some places are going to make up the majority of the decision about whether you get in or not. And then things like activities, essays, and recommendations will follow. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of schools during the pandemic went to something called test optional. And a test optional doesn't mean you don't take the test. In fact, as I lay out in this graphic, it's always good to prep for the test just to get ready, right? Because you're going to be taking tests a lot throughout your life, and you could build kind of your test taking confidence through getting ready for the test. Then obviously you're going to take either the SAT or ACT. Most colleges, or nearly all colleges, accept both tests, and so you want to take them to consider where you're going to be doing better. Maybe sometimes some students do better on one test than the other. Then you're going to get your score, and you're going to use that score to kind of compare how you stack up to everyone else who is applying to that school. Now, some schools release their data on test scores on their website. Others include it in something called the Common Data Set, which you could find by Googling basically the school you're interested in and Common Data Set. And what you're going to find on there is, a year or sometimes 2 years ago, you're going to look at the middle 50%, the top 25%, and the bottom 25% of scores. And what you really want to know is, do I fall in the top 25% or solidly in the middle 50%? And we're going to be talking to David a little bit about this in a minute. And if you fall in the top 25% or you're solidly in the middle of the 50% or on the upper end of that, you have probably a better chance to submit that score, or you should submit that score. And again, talk to your counselors about that, maybe even talk to the college that you're applying to, and they could give you some advice as well. How does your score stack up to others in your high school? And if we could go back to the testing strategy slide for a second there. how does this score stack up to your other scores in your high school? In other words, do you have a good score compared to others in your high school? And does your score help with financial aid? At some places, and you should definitely check this with the schools you're applying to, a good score will actually get you qualified for a scholarship. Now, as you can see on this next slide, we don't have a lot of information about who submits scores and who doesn't. Some schools release that information, many do not. This is a graphic from the College Board, a study they did of 50 colleges and universities that went test optional during the pandemic to show who submitted and who didn't. Now, there are two things to take away from this chart, which in some ways you kind of need a data analytics degree to read, I realize. The first one is basically the lines on the left are students whose scores were below average compared to the rest of the students who apply. So as you can see, as you move to the right on this chart, you get compared to more of the students who had higher test scores. And obviously, as you get closer to the right hand of this chart, more students are submitting scores because they have higher scores. That's the first thing to take away from the chart, that most students who submit scores are solidly in the middle range of scores or at the top of the scores for a school. The second thing you'll notice in this chart is that the blue line at the top is B+, and it's actually above the red line, meaning that the test scores are important, especially for those students who have potentially lower grades, right? This is where test scores really come into play at many schools because it helps you stand out. And that's especially critical in this day and age. And why is that? Because as you can see from this next slide, increasingly we saw a ton of applications over the last couple of years. This is just data from the Common App. The top right shows you the number of applications. And last year, as you can see, there was 1.24 million applicants. Total number of applicants in the top right. And that shows you that there was 1.24 applicants last year. But the bottom left shows you the total number of applications. And you can see more than 7 million were filed compared to just 5 million back in 2019. And again, if you look to the upper right there, you see we only had a couple more 100,000 applications. So more students are applying to more schools. And to deal with this influx of applications, colleges are really trying to add more days to the review process. Now, they can't add more days to the month, but they can kind of stretch out the review process. And as I said earlier, there isn't one application process, and that's certainly true of deadlines. There are multiple deadlines, and as you get deeper into the admissions process, you're going to see this, but you're going to hear words like EA or initials like EA and ED and regular decision. And basically, regular decision is what most people still apply through. And it's probably, again, if you are a parent and went to school in the 80s or 90s, it was even more prevalent back then. But in the last 20 years, and particularly in the last 10 years, there's been a huge rise in EA and ED. EA means you apply early and you may get a decision early, or you may get deferred, but you don't have to actually make a deposit until later on in the year. Early decision is similar to EA, where you apply early, usually sometime around the beginning of November, but those deadlines are different per school, but usually in early fall, mid-fall, around November 1, and then you'll find out usually in December or January. And in EA, again, not binding. You could make your deposit later on in the year, but in ED, it's actually binding, meaning if you get in, your search process is over and you're going to that school. Now, as you can see in this next slide, 37% of the Common App members, and there's more than 1,000 schools now that are members of the Common App, they now offer either early action or early decision. So it's incredibly popular to have earlier and earlier applications. And as you can see from this next slide, more and more colleges are leaning particularly into ED if they have it. And now you may say, you're looking at this and you may say, wow, some of these places still have 40% of their seats or 50% of their seats still available in regular decision. But what this doesn't show is that a lot more students are applying in regular decision. So they may take 50% of their class early when fewer students are applying, and then take the other half of the class in regular when a lot more students are applying. So this is something to think about and strategize as you're thinking about when to apply, whether to apply early, whether that's early decision or early action, or whether to apply regular. So I hope that set the stage for you about the current trends in admissions and some of the big changes in recent years. And that really sets up a conversation with somebody I've gotten to know a little bit on the ground. And that's David Kiskowski, he's the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management at Clemson University. And it's really great to welcome him to this conversation tonight. David, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here.
So David, I know we've talked over the last couple of months about all the changes in admissions over the last couple of years, but I want to get a sense from you, since kind of you're in the belly of the beast, you might say. What's the biggest change in admissions that you believe students, parents, and counselors really should be prepared for, especially those who are with us tonight, who might be juniors, some of them might be seniors, and some of them might even be sophomores or first-year students in high school?
Thank you, Jeff. Before I answer that question, I want to poke a little fun. I'm not sure it was necessary for you to say most of us went to school in the late 80s or so. It made me think, wow, has it been that long? But you have the right time frame. What are the big changes in college admissions? And I am a natural resistor of rankings, and so I'm just going to throw a few at you. It's honestly very difficult right now to think about what are the big changes and not throw out the most recent Supreme Court decision as the most recent. But certainly COVID changed a lot of the way students are experiencing the college search process. We're seeing shifts in the fewer numbers of men enrolling. Those are some of the big things I think some folks are trying to think through. But you spent a lot of time talking about test scores and test optional. I think that relates to COVID, at least tangentially. And I think the number of schools that have moved to being test optional probably comes very close to the top of the list in terms of big changes that impact lots of students and lots of their choices.
So it looks like we lost Jeff, but he'll be back with us in just a moment. David, let's just continue the conversation until Jeff pops back on. As far as strategies for submitting test scores, talk a little bit about that as far as how that's changed, and at least from your perspective at Clemson.
Yeah, I really liked several of the things Jeff said about college being an ecosystem. He really also focused on the notion that individual colleges and universities are different. And honestly, the first biggest piece of advice I would have is that if you're one of these students or that's going to apply to 6 or 7 different schools, maybe a dozen, try to think real hard about that shorter list of schools and work to understand from them not just the entirety of the process and the kinds of things they value, because Jeff's not wrong. This is a business, and while we're all trying to serve students and help them be successful, institutions also have priorities, and those priorities can be a little different. So with respect to test scores, it's no different really than the rest of the discussion, and that is make a connection with the institution you are most interested in or that short list of schools, and try to understand how they use test scores and what they're trying to accomplish with their use of test scores.
So David, how do you evaluate applications with test scores and those without? Can you kind of give us a sense of the differences in terms of how you're reviewing applications?
I can. So at Clemson University, we get 60,100. The count this most recent year, we got 60,195 applications for first-year admission. The notion that we do a holistic review is real. We do, and we can dig into the details of that. I think sometimes people hear either folks are using numbers or they're doing a holistic review. And I think it's really important to know those two things are not mutually exclusive. So we are using data, things we know about applicants who have previously enrolled at the University at Clemson, to line up those things that tend to make students successful. And so the first way that we use a test score is with respect to data. And they help us array students based on a projection or a model of their likelihood to be able to be successful. And so test scores become one of those factors for those students who tell us they want us to use the test score with respect to trying to get to a yes decision. We have been test optional now for 3 years, going into the 4th, and we have 2 models. We have a model that uses test scores to project success. We have a model that doesn't use test scores. And that initial array based on that model, we then plug into a more holistic process. So we simply put, have 2 models, one that uses test scores and one that doesn't. The last piece of what I would say around this with respect to how we use test scores, and this may sound disingenuous, I mean it completely though. And I don't think this is just true at Clemson. We are very much looking for a way to say yes. We get lots of applications, but in the end, we are working really hard to try to find a way to say yes, even though we are selective and competitive. And so if a student applies to us and says that they want us to use their test score, then we do. That doesn't mean that there aren't situations where someone doesn't perform as well on a test that we can still find a way to get to yes. It's also true that there are some of those unique cases where a student might be test optional. They might have said, yeah, I don't really want you to use my test score in the decision. Sometimes we end up, those students send their test scores anyways. And it's not unheard of for us to see a test score on a record for a student that said, I want to be test optional. And maybe they're on the bubble, but that test score would push them into the yes pile. We will use the test score if we happen to have it and it helps them. We try really hard and don't do the opposite. If a student says they're test optional, we make it invisible to the system.
And David, sometimes a test score might be necessary for scholarships, for example, in a state or even at an institution, correct?
And state of South Carolina is a great example of that. The state of South Carolina awards, in part, its state funding for state scholarships with test score thresholds. So if you're a South Carolina resident and you want to maximize your opportunity for a test or a scholarship, then yeah, that test score can really help. As soon as we went test optional as an institution, certainly test scores can put you into the pile of being considered for a scholarship. But we have adjusted when we went test optional, the ways that we give scholarships out for students that have not submitted a test.
So David, one other last question on this test optional, because I think you probably understand that from an outsider's perspective, incredibly confusing, I think, for a lot of parents and students, right? They understand, take the test, get a score, but they may be applying to 5, 8, 10, 12 schools. And some of them they might think they should submit scores to, others they shouldn't. Like, how should you really determine like what's best for you per school, right? So you just talked about Clemson, but Clemson could be different than how other schools approach this. Like again, you're a single institution, but from a consumer's point of view, they're working with, many different schools. Like, how do you really determine whether a school is test optional, especially when a lot of the data isn't out there?
Jeff, I thought we agreed no hard questions. My answer to that question is I don't have a great answer to that question. I think that the best thing a student can do is to do everything they can do. It's exactly what you said earlier. Choosing a college is about choosing an experience, and understanding the kinds of experiences that you want to have is critically important in this process. So even if you're a student that's going to apply to 10 schools, I suspect that most have a short list of schools that are most important to them, and do everything you can do to try to understand the values of that school and what you can learn about how they're using test scores. Your school counselor in your school might be able to give you some data on the range of schools or scores that previous students in your high school have used going to the school and whether they were admitted or not. Try to shortlist the schools you care most about. Try to learn what they're doing. But I concede without debate that this is one of, I think, the most complicated things for students to understand and to think, I figured it out exactly.
Yeah. I want to move off of this particular issue on testing because there's a couple of other things I want to ask you about. You mentioned the notion of kind of a holistic review is real. As you said, you're trying to get to a yes. So what else are you looking at? What else is important in the application?
Yeah. So we are very much trying to find a way to say yes. There are a variety of factors. You've mentioned some of them. The high school performance and the high school record is the biggest factor without question. Courses taken, what are our institutional priorities? We've got 80 or so majors available at the institution, and some of them are more competitive than others based on the demand for those majors. And so that can be a factor. Which major has a student applied for? There are places and areas where women applying for degrees in engineering might be underrepresented in that group, and that could be a way that we give a nod. One of the ways that we work really hard, and Clemson has a somewhat unique process, we work really hard to make sense of the decisions within the high school. So we evaluate applicants within the context of the high school. And while we're using data to do an initial array, we're looking and comparing students to the way other students at that school performed and everything we know to try to move students in and out of what our models might say yes or no are. And so that context of what courses are available in the school, how you did in your school is one of the ways we try to take a more holistic view of it.
So David, we're here in September, right? It's September 12th, and I mentioned earlier about the rise in early action, early decision. Now a third essentially of the Common App members offer some sort of early and early admissions. And I talked about the differences earlier in the webinar. EA, early action particularly, has become popular among a lot of schools in recent years. Why is that? And which applicants or what type of applicants are good candidates to apply EA?
I think this is also sometimes a tricky space to be in. And when a process or an ecosystem, as you've described higher ed, I think very well, when an ecosystem is going through changes, those changes become difficult to interpret during the transition. And so as more and more schools have gone to doing things like using early action or early decision, because college and the college going process is a bit of an ecosystem, the more schools that are in that pool of this is the timeline and this is how the process works, that actually does create pressure on other institutions to consider doing the same thing. And so we, for instance, at Clemson, we have been early action for 1 year. We are going into our second year. In the second year, we will behave a little bit differently because of what we learned in the first year. I think for the most part, colleges and universities are trying to understand as much as they can about the applicant pool, trying to understand which students are serious or not about attending that particular institution, and trying to make decisions to those students to help them get to where they want to go. Our in-state yield rate, for instance, of all the students who are from South Carolina and apply to the university that are admitted, half of all the South Carolina residents we admit end up enrolling at the university. That same number for an out-of-state student is closer to 15%. So it's much more uncertain for us to understand when an out-of-state student applies if we offer admission, whether they're going to actually come or not. And things like early action are part of a process to try to figure out which students are most interested to come or not.
So does that mean that if I'm an out-of-state student and I really want to come to Clemson, it's probably, and these are my words, better to apply early action because it shows I'm really interested in coming there?
Yeah, so it doesn't, I would say it doesn't hurt.
Okay.
And I would say that in our first year, your likelihood of being admitted, either in early action or in our regular decision day, there was no difference. I believe that what we are going to find over time is that we're going to find differential yield rates for students in the applicant pool that is early action versus regular decision. And as that plays out, I think that it could evolve to a situation where it is, if a student wants to give themselves the best chance to be admitted, then being in that early action or early decision pool is more likely than not to be their best option.
David, just a few more quick questions here. Well, first of all, one is you use the word yield, and for those on the webinar tonight, the webcast who may not be familiar with every single term in admissions, I just want to quickly define that. Yield is the percentage of students who accept an admissions offer. So the higher the yield, that means more students who got accepted have accepted that offer, because just because you get accepted to a university doesn't mean you're necessarily going there. So I just wanted to define that for the folks out there. Now, another term that we heard a lot over the last year is deferral. So sometimes what might happen in early action, and I know this happened at Clemson, and this could happen in early decision as well, is that students might apply, and instead of getting an acceptance or a denial, they actually get deferred. What does a deferral mean for students?
Yeah, so this is also one of those terms, but I would encourage students and families to understand exactly what that deferral means at different institutions. Typically, what it means is that we're not yet able to make a decision, so we want you to stay in the pool, and we will make the decision at a future date. That's my simple way to say it. If I were going to get real specific at Clemson, if you applied early action and we make those decisions end of November, early December, if we're able to say yes, we say yes. If we're sure we're not going to be able to admit you, we say no. And then there's a whole group of students in between that we just don't know yet because we don't have the full pool yet, whether it's going to be yes or no, so we defer. There is a way to put the more positive spin on that, and this is what we tell students and we tell families. A deferral is not no. If we know we can't admit you, we're going to tell you, because we don't want to just leave you in limbo. It is my experience with admissions officers around the country. I think they do care very much about student success, and there are some things that we do because of the process and to try to make sure that we're hitting the targets that institutions establish that we don't love. And I think the deferrals, much like wait lists, sort of fall into that category of things we sort of need to do to manage the process sometimes, but we try to minimize the negative impact of it.
David, this has been really helpful, I think, to our audience. As we close this part of the webinar, anything else you want to share with the attendees tonight, the parents, students, the counselors, others, about this thing that me and you kind of, especially you, live every day, but most people are maybe doing this once or twice or a couple times in their life at the most?
Yeah, it was very pleasant to hear you talk about the process of choosing a college is sort of like buying a car every year for 4 straight years. I've often said to folks that choosing a college or university is not like buying a pair of shoes. You know, a pair of shoes, you don't like them, they sit in the bottom of your closet and you wear another pair. It's a much bigger decision than that. And my best advice is understand that there are lots and lots of folks out there trying to help, whether it's friends or family members or school counselors or folks like me at colleges and universities. We really are trying to help students get to places that they're going to be successful at. And so whatever you can do to stay engaged and ask questions, know that folks are trying to help out, and be kind to each other kind of along the way. That's sort of my best advice about it. If you can turn the stress level down, it's going to work out. You're going to find a place and you're going to fall in love with it. And stay cool about it.
David, it's great advice. And I should say that even though I do think, parents and students are consumers and the college is a business at the end of the day, I do think that the people who work in admissions, including you, and I'm not just saying this because you're with me tonight, but I do think that your goal is to help people. And I sometimes think that parents and students sometimes don't ask enough questions sometimes of colleges and universities, and they assume stuff or they hear stuff from others or they hear stuff in their high school. And sometimes I just say, well, did you ask the school, right? And I think that again is where people like you are really helpful, even though you have incredibly busy jobs. So again, I really appreciate you being with us tonight.
Jeff, thanks.
Thank you. And again, David Koskowski, who is Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management at Clemson University. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. So we are about 15 minutes from the end. I want to talk about another big issue tonight about what all this means for your list. You now know the colleges, you know what they're looking for. So does that change how you should think about your list and finding the right fit? Let's talk a little bit about that list. So the first question that I often get is how to think about your list. And there's no right answer to this about how many schools to apply to, although I will say if you're applying to dozens and dozens of schools, that's way too many. And if you're only applying to one school, that may not be enough. I like this idea of 3 to 4 schools in 3 different categories. 3 to 4 schools that are what we often call likely, where you're above the academic range and you're likely to get in. Not guaranteed, not safety, we used to call these safety schools, but likely to get in. 3 to 4 target schools where you're kind of solidly in the middle of that target, of that whether SAT scores or GPAs. And then 3 to 4 schools which are maybe a little bit of a stretch. Now, one thing that I see happen often is that students have a little bit of a creep and families have a little bit of creep in this list. So what ends up happening is that instead of 3 to 4 reach schools, you might have 6 or 7 reach schools. You might only have 1 likely school and then more targets and definitely more reaches. And so I think you have to be really honest with yourself that your list at the end of the day is balanced and that you love every school on that list, because what may end up happening is if you follow this advice of 3 to 4 and say you apply to 9, 10 schools, is you might get denied or waitlisted or waitlisted from the reach schools. You might get into maybe one of your target schools because maybe the other target schools were incredibly popular, or as David talked tonight, you might be applying in a major that is incredibly popular at that school. And so you might end up getting accepted to your likely schools. And as a result, you should make sure that you have visited them, you got to know them a little bit. It's incredibly important that not only do you balance your list, but as I always tell people, love that list as well. Now, in addition to balancing the list of schools, it's also important that you have balance between the academic, social, and financial fit. And I think that the financial fit is incredibly important here. I think most of us know what I mean by academic fit, right? Do they have your major? How are you doing academically compared to other students? Their social fit, is it the right social scene for you? But we don't often talk about financial fit. And there is a number in particular I want to look at in terms of financial. I talked earlier, if you remember that slide, which showed the prices of different colleges and universities. And I said that not everybody pays the sticker price. And one way that you can find this out is by looking at the common data set. Now, as I said earlier, I have a framework in my book called Buyers and Sellers. And I think it's important to remember that during the application process about this financial fit. Now, in my framework, the buyers, they are schools that really need to buy, there's hundreds and hundreds of them, and they essentially have to fill their seats by buying students, and buying students meaning giving a discount. It's not a negative connotation. In fact, there's many great buyers out there in terms of financial aid. And if we could just keep going back to the slide, the previous slide for a second. So those are the buyers. They have to give financial aid out to fill their seats. The sellers, and there's a lot fewer of them, are schools that give out a lot of financial aid, but they mostly give out financial aid to students who have large financial need. Often, what I say, they are selling a degree, meaning that they're so well known around the world that they have more students than they know what to do with in terms of applying. Now, to figure out if a school is a buyer and seller, I have a list on my website that you could download, but you could also look at something called the Common Data Set. I mentioned the Common Data Set earlier tonight, and if you just Google Common Data Set and name of school, you could find this, and you could go to the section of it that is the financial section, and you'll see under scholarships and grants there, institutional financial aid. That's the money that colleges and universities give out. And you can see this example of this school that I have here, need-based aid. They're giving out about $77 million a year in need-based aid. And non-need-based aid, they're giving out almost as much, $74 million in non-need-based aid, meaning that you don't have to necessarily have financial need to get that non-need-based aid. If you go down a little bit lower, you can also see the number of students who had no financial need, who also got awarded these non-need-based scholarships. So you could see, in how many in the freshman class and how many overall got this, and you could kind of get a sense, is this prevalent throughout the university? So it's something that you could see. Now, if we go to this next slide, you could see that you have buyers and sellers. Now, some of this data is a couple of years old, and we had Clemson on here tonight. And again, tons of great buyers from Pitt to Clemson to Tulane to Case Western. And it just means that they are a little bit more generous in some cases. Now, as David said tonight, that yield rate has gone way down at Clemson because the number of applications has gone way up. So this number is slightly off from my buyers and sellers list. But again, this gives you a sense of these are schools that are very similar in terms of their academic profile: the University of Michigan, University of Pittsburgh, UNC and Clemson, Emory and Tulane, Carnegie Mellon and Case Western. But in some cases, you have a seller that may not be giving you as much financial aid, and you might want to consider that buyer. One last slide, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Michael, and then we're going to take some questions tonight as well. I often get a question about, well, how do I find these hidden gems? How do I find places colleges where I can get into and I'm actually going to get out of as well. I'm going to be able to graduate. And I like to look at the list of colleges and universities, and you could find this on Big Future, which is run by the College Board. You could find this on an education department website called collegescorecard.ed.gov. And look, what you're looking for are schools that accept about half to a little bit more than their colleges, than of the students who apply. You're looking for graduation rates that are at least 75%. So at least 3/4 of students graduate in 4 to 6 years. You're looking for retention rates where, again, 3/4 of students return for their sophomore year, and you're looking for a buyer where you might be able to get some merit aid for college. And these are schools that I find where it's not as difficult to get in, and you're going to be able to stay there and graduate and get some money. And if you do a little research on Big Future or College Scorecard, you're going to be able to find some of these hidden gems. And so again, I really thank you for your time tonight. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to turn it back over to Michael, who has some other housekeeping information to go through, and then we'll try to get to maybe a question or two. Michael?
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. And we will get through this as quickly as we can because we can jump into the Q&A. So a little bit about Huntington Test Prep. In fact, this has to do with the SAT and the ACT prep that Huntington offers. And I do encourage people, we're going to send, at the end, you'll see a link for the webinars page, huntingtonhelps.com/webinars. But we just did a really great webinar on the upcoming launch of the digital SAT and talking a lot about that. So I highly advise just pop into that website and you'll see the link in the next slide. But a lot of great information. And as far as Huntington, I talked about the comprehensive evaluation for all of our students, really getting an idea of strengths and weaknesses. Well, when it comes to test prep, we do that. We do a full practice test. The goal is to really pinpoint those strengths and weaknesses so that at the end of the day, we can design a program that's tailored to your students' abilities, goals, needs, everything. We develop that personalized program based upon the results, and then you get set up with a certified tutor to begin that program. And really, it doesn't matter where in the process you are, how soon you are to your test date, we can come up with something to meet your needs. And as I pointed out earlier, there's the evaluation, there's one-on-one online, there's in-center tutoring, test-taking strategies, and then of course the benefit of doing that is the increase in the score. And that, as Jeff has talked about a little bit about the idea of, hey, you can use the SAT, the ACT to help boost your profile for your college admissions. 229 points on average increase on the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT. So I will leave that there, and we'll send more information about the program. You can certainly go to huntingtonhelps.com for more information. But now let's dive into the questions, and there's so many questions, and I know we're not going to get a chance to get through all of them, but if you don't mind, Jeff, maybe we'll go a minute over. And then I also want to make sure that I get a couple of key takeaways from you, as we kind of close things out, as far as key takeaways for parents who are attending. But first question, given the landscape has changed so much and there's not much time to make big changes, right? We're speaking to juniors or to seniors. What's the best steps that my child can take now to improve their chances for admission?
So I think that you definitely want to, watch your grades and try to perform as best on the test. Because again, as we talked so many times tonight, those are going to make up the majority of the decision. So that's number one. Number two, I think you want to look beyond kind of the same schools that everyone is talking about in your high school, that everyone is applying to. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have those reach schools that we talked about earlier tonight. But when you're thinking about your list, think about those schools, those hidden gems, or think about your major that you really might be interested in applying for, and apply to schools that are a little bit maybe off the beaten path, where your chances for admission might be a little bit better, where your chances for merit aid might be a little bit better. As I said, there are 3,900 colleges and universities, 1,400 four-year colleges and universities in that group who have more than 500 students, over 1,000 students. We're still talking about 1,000 colleges out there. So there is a place for everybody, but unfortunately, too many students are applying to the same set of schools over and over again.
This question came in, and I think David talked a little bit about this. I think the question came in a little before his remarks, but do colleges get into the schools in terms of what does an average grade at a school look like, because some schools have a little more rigor, right? They're maybe a little bit tougher. Their baseline class may be more difficult than another school. And this parent is sort of wondering if they take that sort of the school itself in terms of the quality and looking at grades and making their decisions for admissions.
Yeah, so they know a lot about high schools. As I said earlier, along with every single application, or almost every single application, comes something called the high school profile, which is going to talk about the rigor of that school. It's going to show often the grade distribution, not all the time, but often the grade distribution. It's going to show the types of courses that they offer, which admissions officers, in looking at that, can get a sense of. The other thing is that many admissions officers know these high schools. They recruit at them in the fall. They know the counselors. And many of these places are schools that sent students to this college the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. And so they have a lot of data on how these students perform at their university. And so they know a lot about high schools. Where it becomes actually more of a problem, not a problem, but more of an issue, is where students are applying from high schools that may not have a history with a college. You might be applying to a university that never had an applicant from your high school. And that's where they're going to have to do a little bit more digging into the high school. They might need to look closer at the grades and the high school profile. And that's where test scores could potentially be very helpful.
Yeah. And some people have been asking about a guide of when to submit test scores. One person, in sort of a general theme and a few questions, one person said, well, you know, if it's a low GPA, it's beneficial to submit a score? How do those students compare? Another parent wants to know, is there a guide or a rule of thumb to when you submit test scores? Go back to that a little bit and talk about that as sort of
it's a hard one. And, you know, and David, I thought was really honest about that, right? It's incredibly confusing to people outside of the school that you just don't know. And so I think the rule of thumb, and it's not a perfect one because there's always going to be exceptions, but the rule of thumb is if you look at the SAT or ACT spread at a school, and again, you could either get this from the website of the college or you could get this from the common data set for last year, is that you're going to be looking at the top 25% of test takers and who submitted scores. You're going to be looking at the middle 50% scores, and you're going to be looking at the bottom 25% of scores. And so if you're going to submit a score, you definitely want to be in the top of that class, right? So you want to be, you know, top 25% or upper 50%. Now, part of the problem with using that as a rule of thumb is that people who submit tend to have higher scores. So it is going to be skewed higher as a result. But if you're looking at that and your scores are nowhere in that range, you probably should ask, is this the right fit for me? Because if you're way below, you know, if you're in the bottom 25% or not even in the bottom 25%, your score, you may want to ask yourself if you should even apply.
Yeah. And then talk a little bit about too the list making process, because I know parents and I struggled this when I applied to college. And again, I'm in that group of, I went to school in the early 90s. So, and then I had a daughter who went to school and just graduated recently. But talk a little bit about that list making process a little bit, and then we'll go into key takeaways as far as, you know, how do you really define what those schools are that are your sort of your baseline schools that you feel confident about versus the target and the reaches? I mean, how do you distinguish between those three tiers?
I mean, I think you really need to be looking at acceptance rates. And, you know, the average acceptance rate of an American college or university is 64%. So most colleges accept most students. So you're going to not really have too much of a problem finding those kind of foundational schools that you're going to apply to. But as I said, what ends up happening is that I don't think people are honest with themselves in terms of some of the schools that they put on their list, and they're like, oh, everybody has a shot. And again, I don't want to discourage anybody from applying to a school that they really want to go to, but be honest with yourself to say, okay, as I'm looking at this list, I really do have a third, which is a little bit of a stretch. I do have a third that's kind of, I'm right in the middle. And I do have a third where it's likely that I can get in, not guaranteed, but likely. And I think that if you have that balanced list, you're going to come out on the other side successful.
Yeah. And then also balance in-state versus out-of-state in terms of where you're at, right? Is that another factor they should consider?
Yeah, I think that's another factor. As David mentioned, for example, you know, he knows that he's going to have a higher yield rate on in-state students. So if you really want to go to an out-of-state school, first of all, know that it's going to probably be more expensive for you. Make sure you check out the financial aid of that school. But as he said, if you don't apply early, or as I interpreted his remarks, if you don't apply early, it might be a little bit more difficult because they're not quite sure if you get accepted whether you're actually going to come.
Yeah. So let's do, before we close things out, let's do a couple of key takeaways. You know, there's been a lot of information, and I think a lot of great information. And for people who have asked, yes, we are going to provide the slides, and the on-demand webinar is going to be available. We'll send that out via email. And then we also publish everything, as you can see, huntingtonhelps.com/webinars. Jeff's webinar, his past webinars are all on that site, as well as our most recent webinar on the digital SAT, which is coming. So definitely check that out if you don't see it in your inbox. But before we close things out, Jeff, a couple of key takeaways for parents as a way to kind of sift through all the information. You know, what are some of the things that they should really take away from your conversation today with David and your presentation overall?
So I think number one, really kind of understand the process. If you're a sophomore or junior on this call tonight, take the time to really become an informed consumer. Don't just jump into this process and say, okay, here are the 5 schools or 10 schools I want to apply to. Kind of get a sense of all the schools out there, visit as many as you can, get a sense of what you want, number one. Number two, take the test. There's a lot of confusion about testing right now. I know there will be probably for quite some time. Take the test, prep for the test. It's going to do you well over time to get ready for that test, and then get your score, and then decide whether you want to submit it or not. And again, it may, as we just talked about, it may be you submit it at some schools, but not others. And then finally, I guess the best piece of advice that I can really give, the big takeaway from tonight, is that this is an incredibly complicated process. I get that. People like me and David, we live it almost every day. Most of you are coming to it, once or twice in your lifetime. And I think that there's only so much you could control in this process. So control what you can control and let the chips fall where they may. And if you did your homework, if you took the test and got your score and submitted it in some places and didn't others, and you balanced your list, things will work out. Where it doesn't work out, where you don't get in or you don't get the financial aid, is where I think people didn't do their homework, or they didn't really follow their own advice in terms of applying.
Yeah, and I think your advice earlier, which I hadn't heard before, but it makes perfect sense, is to really treat this as a very, very serious purchase, like buying a car every year or buying a house. I think the house purchasing is really key, because when you go through that process, you ask a lot of questions. So ask a lot of questions, really do your homework, as you pointed out, because I think that's going to be a real key to being an educated and smart consumer and getting the results that you want. Would you agree?
Definitely. And again, the more research that you do, the more that you start this early, not too early, the less stress you're going to have. Because if you're rushing through this process later on, if you're trying to look at schools, take a test and do well in school, it's going to be stressful.
Yeah. Jeff Selingo, thank you so much. And of course, sign up for his newsletter, folks. Go to jeffselingo.com. You can also follow him on social medias and Instagram and Twitter at jselingo. Jeff, thank you so much. You always bring great stuff, and we really appreciate the partnership and all the information you share with everybody.
It was great to be here, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight.
Great. So everyone, that concludes today's presentation. Again, we're going to make this available on demand, so look for an email the next day or two. We'll send that out, and then of course sign up for Jeff's newsletter. You can get lots of great information. Look for his books on Amazon. A lot of great resources there. And then of course, if you're in the mode of test prep and getting ready for that, I said look back at some of the webinars we've done on the digital SAT, as well as our test prep services at Huntington. But that concludes today's event. On behalf of Huntington Learning Center and Jeff Selingo, I want to say thank you so much for your time. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care, everybody.